Welcome, Ali Norrell. Welcome to the new podcast where we talk about lots of things that are helpful for people, whether it's health issues, emotional issues, spiritual issues, energetic issues. Let's just see what comes up. And as I mentioned before we started the recording, this is not an interview. This is a conversation. This is just a lovely chat to get to know you. You're not only a very successful author, you began as a birth doula, fertility and reflexologist healer, and you also are a psychic and you are a medium. And all of that you've kind of amalgamated it together from what I understand and become now what you are.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Thank you. Yeah,
So obviously you and I met, it's 10 years ago now.
it is. Yes, I thought that before I came on here. It is 10 years.
Yeah, it'll be 10 years next month. Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I was thinking that we could talk to begin with about your birth doulaing and your fertility side of things, because I find my previous job as a clinical massage therapist, as a craniosacral therapist, I used to rehabilitate a lot of postnatal women. So the birth doula world is a world that I'm very accustomed with, but a lot of people don't necessarily know about it.
Yeah.
It would be fantastic if you explain first what it is, because some people know it, some people haven't got a clue,
Sure.
and in what capacity that can help people.
So, well, actually, I might say that that is actually how we met, isn't it? Because you did, I don't mind saying here that I had a terrible diastasis recti after the birth of my fourth very large baby, and you were helping me with that, and that's how we connected and became friends. And for me, birth doulaing also came to me in a fairly unusual context in that I had trained in reflexology. And an interesting point of note in this conversation, I think, is that when I did my reflexology training, I was asked to sort of specialize is a little bit of a heavy term. We're not doctors, obviously, but we were asked to sort of pick an area of specialty to sort of really focus in, do a project on and some case studies. And I can remember thrashing about with different modalities at the time. And I can remember saying to my husband, I can't decide between birth and death, which sounds like a very odd, but I really couldn't. I was thinking, do I go with fertility and pregnancy or do I go with palliative care? And I really was torn between the two. And I have known really most of my life, I've understood that there is a close proximity between those worlds that actually in our lived experience, we tend to want to separate because we don't really like to think about and talk about death too much. And birth also, in many ways, that's kind of messy and painful, and we don't want to talk about that either. But I went down the birth route and I started working very quickly with women who were trying to become pregnant and who had we were becoming pregnant. And I certainly don't hold my hand up and say that's because they had the reflexology, but obviously combining various different approaches. Happily, many of my clients went on to become pregnant. And I would give them pregnancy reflexology. And then it started happening that they would say, well, look, could you come to the birth? Because we spent a lot of time talking about birthing, the process of birthing, and what was happening mentally and physically, but mostly the mental aspect. So basically, we're literally the hand holders and I don't particularly care for the term holding the space, but that is kind of what a doula does. And I think that's an understandable way to put it, to enable that.
Kind of like if you think of, the past and how we were tribal, you'd have the tribal women, the older women that would hold the space, if you want to term.
Yeah, exactly.
For the pregnant woman, and those women, those older ladies would guide, rub backs, help to breathe, but didn't necessarily medically get involved.
Exactly. And obviously, when you go through doula training, you are advised in that capacity. You obviously keep medical stuff to a minimum if you can, but obviously, if it's an emergency situation, you may be called to step in. I've never been asked to do that, but it's good to feel like you could. So I did my doula training with Michelle O'Don, who re-pioneered water birth. Brought sort of obviously water birth hasn't been invented by anybody. It's just something we've done. But he came up with this and thought, hey, water would be a great place for a woman to birth a baby. Women need to feel safe. But I think we've got the other end of things, which is women who are just frightened of their bodies and frightened of giving birth, saying, I just want somebody else to control this. And that's, to me, now then we've got like unnecessary C-sections and all other sorts of complications starting to creep up and up and up, because women just don't believe in their own bodies and they don't trust them. And I think it's one thing if you've been told, look, there is categorically something going on here, and if you birth this way, then this, and this will happen, as opposed to, you're pregnant, how do you want to do it? I just don't want to do it. Somebody else take the responsibility. That's tragic to me. What if we did that with all our bodily functions? Because giving birth is a bodily function. And to a point, for a lot of women, that is what their body is born to do, but they don't even get off the starting block. They just don't want to engage with it.
It's very much the ability to know your body.
Yes.
Know the layers, know how it works, know how it functions, understand it so that you're not frightened and give the complete authority to somebody else. If we are able to understand how we work and how we function, how we move, how the layers are, it doesn't mean that you don't give the autonomy to somebody else, but it means that you have the ability to question. You have the ability to say, okay, I have this condition, or my pregnancy is this, or my body's doing that. If you understand how it works, then you can ask questions.
Exactly. And also it then becomes a conscious choice. And because, control is spoken about a lot in the world of birthing. And I actually think, to birth successfully, you really need to relinquish control to a degree. But I think also it's about having, yes, if somebody needs help, it needs to be a conscious choice. I feel that's empowering for the birthing woman. I've been in many births where, a medical professional, and don't get me wrong, a lot of my family are medical professionals. I respect them highly. I always seek to work with them. I always defer to them in a birthing scenario. But I've been in many situations where, we've got the lights low, we're in a hospital, the woman's doing brilliantly. And at one particular birth comes to mind in a very exclusive private hospital in London that I was working in at the time. A male obstetrician came in and just said, right, how long have your contractions been going? And so I was trying to answer for my client. And I said, well, maybe like 3 hours. She's doing really well. And he went, okay, well, if they're not speeded up by 9 a.m., we'll book you in for cesarean, and walked out. And then she just clamped up. And you know what? That woman ended up with a cesarean. And I've never forgotten that, because it made me angry, because I feel like she wasn't even given a chance to trust her body. Sweep in and start talking cesareans when she's been going for a day and nothing's happening, or it made me cross. She'd just been admitted. Why? And then we complain about the rising C-section rates that are unnecessary.
It's very interesting, because I think that's one of the things that people don't understand about energies and vibration.
Yes.
Is he came into the room, his energy, his vibration was very clinical, very, I'm going to the office and I'm filing the papers, basically.
Yeah, basically.
And I've entered the room where there's a different vibration, there's a different space, there's sort of fluidity happening. And then, gosh, you've changed vibrations, like throwing a stone in water.
Exactly.
Ripple. And then it's time for it to settle back.
And absolutely right. I think, and where we put our intentions as well, what would have happened if that obstetrician had come in with the intention of observing the woman, as a lot of excellent midwives do, and I've worked with many of them. They will come in quietly, they will observe. They won't be, sometimes clients are like, why isn't she chatting? But because she's watching you and she's checking in with the energy, and she's just instinctively doing what she knows she needs to do to see what you need. That's how she will assess whether you need further help, assistance, any medical intervention. She's going to watch what's going on and feel the room. Whereas, other individuals will come in and just immediately it's their intention, which overrides everything else. We just need to reconnect with ourselves.
That is such a beautiful thing to say. And it is so true. We so sort of out of our system, and we're constantly trying to absorb information from lots of different places, whether it's books, whether it's people, whether it's Instagram, whatever.
Yes.
And it's like, well, where are you? Where is your center? Connect to your sensation, connect to your body. If you're able to connect to the actual physical sensations that your body is going through, then you'll know, the body whispers, the body genuinely speaks.
Exactly. Really believe that. And hey, I've had 4 incredibly positive birth experiences. That was not luck. and neither was it intensive training. It was self-belief. You know, I asked myself that question a lot when I worked with a doula. I was like, what can I impart to women that I work with? And every time it was self-belief, self-belief. You know, I had a ridiculous amount of self-belief. I tend to have that in my life anyway. But when it came to giving birth, I just knew I was going to do this. In fact, I couldn't wait to do it. I was thinking, I've seen all these women doing this. I want to go. And I thought, you know, why can't I want to help other women to feel that way, because it's so empowering. The first thing I said after I'd given birth for the first time, I turned to my doula and I said, well, I'd do that again. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't pain-free. I didn't breathe my baby out. You know, but life is tough, right? Life is hard, and it's painful. And giving birth, yes, there is pain, but there is a point to the pain. And I just think if we can all learn to be a little more accepting of the difficulties in our lives, I think we tend to want to avoid them, to sort of control them, to damp them down a bit, put them over there. If you just kind of face up to them and really confront them, it's not easy, but, you know, nobody said that the point of life was to be easy. I think that's maybe another misconception that we have. I believe we're here to learn, and learning is hard.
That's such a beautiful statement, and it kind of weaves beautifully into the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, you know, life can be excruciatingly painful, whether physical or emotional.
Sure.
And that brings me to your book, The Truth Inside, which is a very different topic. We're talking now about death, but life and death, even though we separate them, they are very much the same, because it's the process of transforming and getting onto a different side. You know, sort of the energy or the soul transforming, coming into this world, and then the energy, the soul transforming and going into the next layer, wherever that matrix is, wherever that world is. So the Truth Inside it was a book that you wrote in 2014. Is that correct?
I think 2015 it would have been, because my youngest son was a newborn at the time, and I wrote around the time that we met, actually. It must have been,
No, it was a book about Romy.
It was, yes. So Romy was our third child. She's my second daughter. And she was born in March 2014. Really healthy pregnancy, lovely home birth, no issues, super healthy baby, actually very kind of chilled out, happy baby. And then when she was 4 months old, completely out of the blue, she was taken ill. And it was one of those situations. It was just an emergency, straight to hospital, MRI scans, all sorts of tests, everything. At the end of which they ascertained that she'd had some kind of severe bleed to the brain. So they never actually did come out and say what they thought the cause of her death was, but their best guess was sort of some kind of aneurysm. It's one of those things that, you know, she could have lived to 20, 30, 40. It's something, you know, one of those ticking time bombs that goes off in your head at any time. And this just happened when she was a baby. So yeah, we were admitted to the hospital on one day, and by the following day, we had to elect to turn off life support because there was no brain activity. So it was incredibly traumatic. I was on my own with her when she was taken ill. So that was actually when I was processing the whole situation for many years afterwards. That was very often the hardest part for me because of my spiritual beliefs and my practices. I was less concerned. I believe there's some kind of afterlife. I have had experiences all my life, and indeed I'm a medium. I work with them. I choose to develop it. So I feel fairly at peace with, how do I put this? My spiritual self feels at peace with my daughter being elsewhere, and understanding that there's a greater picture. Obviously, my human earthbound self has to deal with that grief and trauma, but the trauma part was possibly the hardest part for me because of the nature of how everything happened and how quick it was, and the feeling of helplessness. And as a mother, this feeling of like, I should have, what did I do? I should have done more. This is my fault. I should have done this, this, and this. What would have happened if I'd done that? You know, if I heard somebody else talking like I was thinking back then, I would have thought they were being ridiculous. But obviously, this is what our brain does when we've experienced trauma, I think. So, yeah, so The Truth Inside is basically a book. I wrote it because there was nothing available to me in the early days of my grief that addressed my grief in line with my spiritual beliefs, which is that, not even about beliefs. My husband is very interested in Buddhism, and we had many conversations late into the night at that time. Like, why has this happened? Why her? Why us? Where is she? That thing that happened that was really weird yesterday, like be some kind of thing. We would turn up at bereavement groups and we would be, you're actively told not to discuss things like that. Not just that, but if you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish, it's like, no, don't mention your beliefs. You just have to talk about what happened to you and how you feel now and support each other. And, that was okay, but it wasn't helpful for me personally. In fact, now I'm working closely with an amazing organization. They're US founded, but they do have a branch in the UK, and I would love to mention them. They're called Helping Parents Heal, and they are for bereaved parents. They have 26,000 members across the world now, I think. I've been invited to their conference later this summer in Arizona, and they put bereaved parents and siblings together with psychic mediums. And this is exactly what I was looking for and couldn't find. I obviously sought out mediums and to try and make sense of the things that were happening in our home. But I just thought if I could maybe help one or two other people who may have experienced loss, particularly loss of a child, to try to understand that what I think I believe, I don't know it for a fact, I can't prove anything, but I believe that we continue in some way. Our energy continues after we pass, after our physical body dies. And I wrote The Truth Inside to try and make sense of my own experiences and also to sort of try to give them to others as perhaps a point of comfort if they'd experienced loss.
I think it's invaluable to share experiences like this, because especially as you say, people don't really talk about it, and people don't know how to deal with grief because they don't talk about it. So the person in the suit is struggling, and the people around it, some are very supportive, some go to the extreme, and some disappear.
Yes.
So it's what I find, sort of coincidences or not. I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that the universe has its hand and its power.
Yeah.
But obviously, you and I met at the time that you were rehabilitating for diastasis. But I remember it was very much the nearing the anniversary of Roman's death, and my father had died, and they died. I think it was the same day or 2 days.
I believe they were taken ill on the same day, and they both died on the 18th of July. They
both had brain bleeds, and we both had to turn off the machines. So, I say it, and literally all the little hairs in my body stand up.
Yeah, me too.
Kind of like, wow, okay, so there's a reason why you and I are talking, and there's a reason why you and I met.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting because I'm dealing with a lot of patients that are dealing with grief and loss, not necessarily of a child, but loss of a partner.
Yeah.
And I think, whether it's just the loss of somebody, the way I tried to describe it to this particular patient who was really, really struggling, she was left with 2 young children.
Oh.
And I said, basically what in my viewpoint, sort of we are all resonance, we are all vibration, because we're made of atoms. We're made of atoms and electricity, and when those atoms change the consistency, as in when the person's body is no longer here, it doesn't mean that the atoms have disappeared. They've just changed consistency. I remember trying to explain this to my daughter at the time when she lost her grandmother, and she couldn't understand where her grandmother had gone. She was 10 years old, and she really struggled at the time with the loss. And I said to her, okay, so visualize it like a vase of water with a load of roses. As the roses start to wither and disappear, the water starts evaporating. And it doesn't mean that the water's no longer there. It's just evaporated and turned into a cloud. But the water is still there. It's just a different consistency.
Right.
So they are with you. They're just not in the format of the vase with the water in it.
Exactly. And not a format that you can necessarily, you can feel it, you can sense it, but you don't necessarily see it. Yeah.
When you say the psychic mediumship, I remember at the time that you and I met, you said you didn't want to deal with your gift because it was so challenging.
Yes.
And now you're obviously now entering and really using and working with it. So how are you using it and working with it and helping people with the marriage of life and death?
So, well, it's twofold really. And it's interesting because, also what I write about in The Truth Inside is the fact that this really challenged my spiritual beliefs. The first question I asked myself, which I've always imagined, people reading the blurb for this book must think, but how did she not know? The first thing I asked myself, well, if I call myself a psychic medium, and I've been developing my mediumship for years and years and years before I became a mother even, then, well, how did you not know your own child was not going to stay here? I asked myself that question many times, and I believe that the answer is because we are not meant to know certain things. Obviously, if I'd been party to that information, what would I have done with it? You can't control your life, and you're not meant to control most of your life. That's what I believe. And I think if somebody had said to me, and I do believe that a medium that I happened to have consulted not long before I got pregnant with Romy, in retrospect, acted in a slightly odd way, because I think I asked him, will I have any more children? And he behaved a little strangely, and the sitting was just coming to a close. Understanding what I do about the nature of that work, I feel quite strongly that he probably did have some kind of sense that something was coming. And if you're a good practitioner, you never obviously share any information like that. Firstly, because you could have translated it wrongly. And secondly, because you don't give people information about their own lives, deaths or the deaths of anyone else or serious illnesses. There are certain codes of conduct with that information. But in retrospect, when I think about how he reacted to my question, I think he probably did sort of sense something. So I'd said after Romy died, I said, I'm never doing this again. I'm turning my back on the whole thing. I don't trust it. I've lost my faith in it. And also, I'm never going to be able to work as a psychic medium because I'm in the throes of my own grief. How on earth can I possibly walk alongside somebody else? And interestingly, my mother, who is pretty psychic in her own way, but chooses not to sort of engage with it very much. But at key moments in my life, she's so non-interfering, it's crazy. But at key moments in my life, she will often sort of say something that sticks with me. And I do remember she said to me, I think you're going to work with bereaved parents as a medium. And I said, no, that's never going to happen, Mum. Like, never, not doing that. The other thing I said I would never do is work with pregnancy, work as a doula, because I just thought, well, I can't. What if the person is giving birth to a healthy baby girl? How am I going to feel about that? How will I deal with that? What if, God forbid, something should happen in that birthing scenario? I'll fall apart. I won't be able to cope. I couldn't even save my own daughter. How am I going to be able to do that? And it took me, really, it's been 10 years in July since Romy passed. And it took me really up until last year to get my head around the idea that actually, because I was like, I want to come back, I want to work, what should I do? And I kept coming up with all these different ideas for what I was going to do. And I think a very close friend said to me, but you've done all this training and you've done all the, why don't you just do what you were supposed to be doing in the first place? And because she put it like that, I questioned it. And it started with me, I connected with Helping Parents Heal through a mutual contact, and they loved my book and wanted me to talk about my book to their members in the US, which I did. And then they said, come to our conference. And then I thought, well, maybe I could just maybe do a few sittings. So I started to do that. And I have worked with several bereaved parents as a medium. And I've gone back to my old mentor, my mediumship mentor that I studied with for many years. She accepted me back into her class, which is amazing. So I've sort of been getting back in touch with it and really strengthening that muscle, because that is kind of how I view it. Alongside that, I'm also working sort of with intuitive guidance. So I sometimes work with tarot cards, and that's more on people with life situations wanting guidance. So I work a little with that too.
Yeah. So tell me if, if any of the listeners are thinking, they've lost somebody or they've lost a child, in what way does mediumship help? Because, there's a lot of skeptics out there.
Yes.
For those that are a bit skeptical and a bit, but they're also really struggling, we were talking about at one point of the difficulty of managing pain and managing challenges and the journey, and actually realizing that the pain is you being alive. But if
Yeah.
you needed support or you needed something, sort of I support people through cranial sacral by calming their sympathetic nervous system down. That's how I support people with grief. And I know that, for example, for me, when I've been grieving both my parents, I used a lot of yoga and breath work and just lots of movement. And ironically, going back to the conversation we were having about being in your body, I needed to connect to my body to actually realize that I am on this earth. And
Yeah.
I utilized my breath and very gentle yoga to help me with my grieving process. So how would you suggest that medium and psychic modality could help somebody?
That's a brilliant question because I agree, there are lots of, and quite rightly so. I mean, I think it's very healthy to be skeptical. I'm skeptical. When I've experienced things, like the first thing I do is try to discount it. Okay, but it's been because of that. Or, I was standing there and of course the light was going to hit that. And that, I immediately try to discount what I'm experiencing, not in a necessarily negative or skeptical way, but just because I want to understand what's happening. So there are lots of places like the Windbridge Institute in the US who conduct really in-depth psychic research. In fact, if I want to go, which I do sometimes want to go ahead and become a certified medium with Helping Parents Heal, they have a quintuple blind reading system that scares a lot of people off. You basically have to read blind for a sitter down a phone line. You can't see them. You don't know their name, nothing about them. And you do that 5 times and they rate you. And then if you get over a 60% rating on all 5 sittings, Helping Parents Heal will then certify you. So there are, and people like Windbridge do similarly, but actually more in depth. And they also work visually with some symbolic cards. And there's lots of really exciting research going on. There's also lots more scientific explanation coming out now about exactly what you were describing, the fact energy, how energy works, how our bodies actually are containers for energy, and how, even doctors now are coming out and saying energy carries on after the body is done. So that's exciting. And I welcome that as a medium because I'm not, how could I put this politely? I'm not interested in the brand of woo woo. I'm just not. I'm interested in helping parents to navigate, helping people to navigate life, particularly bereaved parents. How mediumship can help is on many layers, but it's often in the unexpected layers that it's most helpful. So the questions we tend to have when we are grieving a person is, why has this happened? Where are they? Are they okay? If somebody has gone through a prolonged or a traumatic or an unexpected passing or death, that can leave those of us behind really worrying that they were in pain at the end, or, they felt terrible, or they were on their own, or so try to understand what happens around the process of death and where our energy or our spirit or our soul or whatever words feel right for the person in question. Where is that now? And are they still a recognizable version of our loved ones? And as a medium, so that also a psychic and a medium, those are 2 different things. So there's a saying that all mediums are psychic, but not all psychics are mediums. So as a psychic, I tend to tap into that part of my work. I use tarot as a prompt. So just to be clear, I don't memorize the meanings of tarot cards and tell you, oh, the 2 of Swords means that this will happen to you. I don't work that way. I respect those who do. For me, it's a prompt. I look at an image and then I get information in my head about the person sitting in front of me. And that can be quite mundane or practical information like, oh, if you've got an issue with somebody in your workplace at the moment, have they taken over a project that you're working on? I will get that kind of information. It just pops into my head. And I believe that we all have that ability. We're all born with it. We all know what's going on. And if we tap into it, then we can have those insights about ourselves and actually about other people. How many times have you walked into a room and just thought, oh, I'm not sure I like that person very much, but I don't know why. I've never met them before. Or you're going hunting.
How many times have you thought of somebody and suddenly the phone rings?
Exactly. How many times have you been hunting and just thought, no, this is not the house for us, even though it's beautiful and it's got all of the things that we want on paper. No, it just doesn't feel right. So we all do that. That's really our psychic ability. As a medium, we connect with the essence of those who have passed I refer to it as the spirit world. But it doesn't matter. You can say heaven, the parallel universe. It doesn't matter what we call these things. what feels right to us. For me, it feels, I refer to the spirit world. And maybe I could give an example, though obviously an anonymous example, but there was a sitter I had recently who was a lady who her daughter had passed. She had been 5 years old and she had been living with cancer for most of her young life, and in the end had passed with that condition. Obviously, and this is what I thought I could never do, right? I sat with that woman, her daughter passed last year. And, part of what you have to do as a medium really is to feel it. And I had to go back into what that experience had been like for me, how I had felt when my daughter had recently passed, and feel the rawness of her pain. And so, I sat with her, I connected with her. And then as a medium, how I work is I tend to see images. I'm clairvoyant, so I tend to see them. It's as if there's a screen, the back of if I close my eyes, it's like I have a screen in front of my eyes and I can see images on the screen. And then you work with translating those images. Sometimes they can be symbols or words, and then you're like, what the hell does that mean? Sometimes you'll have to ask a question, but as you get more practice, you start, whenever I see that symbol, I know that that means this. So how I worked with this lady is I did manage to make a connection with her daughter. But always, 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 it is the seemingly insignificant things that are the most helpful, because what this lady wanted to know, was her daughter okay? Was her daughter there? Like, was I really connecting with her daughter? And I was able to say to her that I could see this little girl with a particular toy. I was able to describe the toy in detail. This was her daughter's favorite toy. I was describing to her where her daughter's resting place was. And I think this is a banal enough detail that I could share. I suddenly said, are you seeing blackbirds every time you go to her resting place? And I see you sitting there and I can see always a blackbird coming. And she said, yes, not just, are there blackbirds over there, hopping around on a fence, but like, does one come and sit right at your feet? Have you had that experience? And she had. Often with people, and this has happened to me personally, it's robins. There are people who believe that when you see robins, particularly sort of slightly unseasonally, it sort of signifies that a loved one in the spirit world is nearby. And myself and my youngest son actually have had some extraordinary encounters with robins that have really left me thinking, I kind of, that sounds like a silly thing to me, but I'm really thinking I might believe it.
I have a really close friend who her father passed away many years ago, and for her it's a dragonfly.
Right. Yeah.
You don't get dragonflies randomly, especially nowadays.
No, that's right.
But she knows, and when he passed, there were dragonfly, there was a definite connection, and when it's nearing the anniversary, suddenly a dragonfly flies near her or by her, so it does, there is always a connection of some sort.
They're so symbolic of, these two worlds, right? Birth and death, because a dragonfly emerges and it's so beautiful, but I understand they have a fairly short lifespan. So not only do they sort of shed this chrysalis-y thing that they emerge from, so that kind of becomes something they leave behind. So I think they're symbolic of being born and dying, and also of rebirth. So they're very spiritual symbols and very commonly seen by people with sort of spiritual beliefs as well. So I think, to finish answering your question in a very long-winded way, I think, what mediumship can do, in my opinion, is to offer, I don't use the word proof because I don't use that word lightly, and I don't believe you can prove that there is life after death any more than I can prove that God exists. These are things that how do you prove it? I don't know. But I think it gives us an insight into the idea that we continue after our body dies. And the way that we do that is to say, did your daughter own an orange monkey that she took to bed every night? And, I've never met this woman before. I know I don't know that information about her. I think a skeptic would argue, well, these days with the internet, you can Google anyone and look up. Yes, you can. I don't, obviously, although I'm sure it's tempting to do so if you're working, particularly when you work remotely with somebody as a medium. I just don't do it because I think that actually would get in my head and confuse me even more. So I prefer to know nothing, because then it's the little things like, was your father's favorite brand of chocolate this? Or, it's those things that when you can give that to a person who's grieving, it tells them that you are connected with their loved one. And then once you've made that connection, what I always ask them for is like, is there a message? Is there something you want to say? And there usually is. And it is usually something seemingly insignificant, like I'm okay. Or, at the end, I was peaceful, or, I was on my own, but all of my loved ones in the spirit world came to meet me. I wasn't alone. And I know you've been worrying about that. Don't worry. It's always something like that, which I'm well aware that a skeptic could argue that you could just pull a load of stock phrases out of the air. But in my experience, I do feel I'm able to connect with the worry or the concern that the bereaved person has, and ask their loved one in spirit to try to ease that for them and reassure them, and ultimately to reassure them that, when our time comes, it's beautiful. Wherever we go to and whatever form we're in, I definitely believe that it's infinitely better than what we experience here. I think we're here to learn. This is a classroom. And I think this is where the really, really difficult stuff happens when you think about the amount of pain and suffering. And ironically, we think about something like giving birth. That's nothing. Look at what people do to each other in this world, on all levels. So I believe that's because we are learning it, and that's for our spiritual advancement. And when we're done learning here, where we return to infinitely, infinitely better. I mean, religions that talk about heaven and hell, I would almost argue this is hell. I don't think, it's tough. It's very tough.
It's funny because I feel very similar in a way, in the sense that this is the learning ground for your soul to develop, grow, and change, and for your energy and vibration to evolve.
Yeah.
With that, sort of whether you are a base vibration or a higher vibration, it doesn't mean that one's better than the other. Everyone now is like, oh, I need to be in a higher vibration. It's like, no. You need to be in your own vibration, whatever that may be. And one of the things that I personally felt very strongly when I went to see a medium was the knowing that I'm not alone.
Yes.
Knowing that when in the darkest moments of life, which they always come, sort of, we get good days, we get bad days. You can actually say, you know what, I just need a little bit.
That's right.
And you call them in, whoever they might be. It might be even your own child, but their energy can come and support you and be there to hold the space.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a very strong argument for sort of seeking support from a medium. And that, my belief is that a medium is exactly that, a support, maybe some guidance, but, I don't believe it's about, conjuring up the dead. And, it's certainly not about the things that people always, well, not always, but some people say, getting the lottery numbers or, working out how to, it's always the thought that I put up before every sitting that I do is to always have the connection and the information that is for that person's highest good, their highest good. And that would mean that, sometimes somebody will come and they'll be wanting, well, am I going to get this job? Now, it might not be in that person's best interest to know whether they're going to get that job or not, because there might be some other things that have to happen along that pathway before they reach there. And if I were to say to them, well, actually, no, you're not, they could be devastated. They could chuck things in the air, go and do something else. And the reason they're not might be because there's something better coming along that's going to serve them better for their higher purpose. And maybe they're not meant to work in the corporate world. Maybe they're meant to teach children, but they just don't see that yet. So this is why we have to be very careful how we give information.
I completely agree with that statement. And what a wonderful place to finish this beautiful conversation. Ali, it's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy.